I'd like to thank Chuck Friedman for giving me the opportunity to speak to you in this presentation today, and my thoughts about the patient experience and epistemic rights and how they can inform what we're doing within medical informatics. A little bit about myself. I have a PhD in medical informatics, and I do teaching and research of that in Australia currently. I'm a long-term patient going back to a couple of childhood cancer. And this kind of long-term experience as a patient and being a medical informaticist has led me to view and explore the patient experience through the various things that I've learned as a medical informaticist. And one of the things is going back to my childhood and my illness is that I got a great love for the Greek myths. And I wanted to frame today's presentation with the myth of Prometheus and the birth of civilization. So you may recall that Prometheus gave to humans the gifts of writing, mathematics, science, and most famously fire. In short, all the tools that humans needed to create civilization. And what I would like to do is draw a parallel to that, to the birth of medical informatics. And I'm going to start with the story of Homer Warner, and certainly people could start with other origin stories, but I'm from Utah where Homer worked, and so he's my origin story. So Homer started as a traditional cardiovascular researcher in the 1950s after completing his medical degree and a PhD. But by the 1960s, he had started blending digital computers, engineering, mathematics, and medicine to novel ends. And by the end of the 60s, he had created a surgical ICU with extensive real-time physiological monitoring and display. He went down to the ICU one day, and there was a nurse at a bedside, and with all this monitoring, there was a yellow light indicating that something was wrong with the patient. But what he found was that this nurse was simply frustrated. The monitor was telling her that there was something wrong. There were physiological signals everywhere, but nothing was helping the nurse know what she should do. As Homer put it, we'd overwhelmed her with information. We had all this data, but we didn't know what it meant. Paul Clayton, one of Homer's early collaborators, writing about this situation, said, "This nurse clearly needed help in the interpretation of the data. It required that the computer have some medical knowledge built into it." And those of you that are familiar with this story will know that this was the birth of the health system, the electronic medical record system that Homer built in the 60s and 70s to help share knowledge in the care of patients. And so, but if I'm going to take this and apply it to the patient experience, and I think just as Prometheus gave humans the tools to create civilization, Homer Warner and his peers and subsequent disciples have given healthcare the tools to exercise epistemically informed care. But just as the ICU nurse was provided data but not knowledge, today's patients might have access to their data, but it's very unlikely that they are provided the knowledge to help them understand the data. And so patients need more Promethean gifts to help them achieve what I'm referring to as healthcare as persons. So to explain what I mean by this healthcare as persons, let's jump back and join Warner and 1960s medicine. And so in 1964, the American Medical Association was holding its annual meeting in San Francisco. And as part of that meeting, there was a session entitled "The Patient as a Person." Well, when I first read that, I was just a little perplexed, like, a patient isn't always a person? This just seemed like a tautology. But if we step back and think about what a person is and how patients were at the time, and maybe also now, were treated, you see it's not a trivial question. So if I'm thinking about what is a person, easy to state, maybe not so easy to answer. But to me, I'm going to stick with that a person is a biological structure and with imagination, knowledge and understanding, values, and agency, or the ability to make decisions. And I'm lumping all these things into what I'm going to refer to kind of as epistemic needs, and along with those epistemic needs are epistemic rights. Well, what is a patient? Well, famously, the health economist Uwe Reinhardt quipped that a patient is a biological structure yielding cash. When I was a medical informatics student in the 1990s, patients in that setting were really little more than a biological entity generating signals that were then used within our computer applications. And in the context of the patient experience writ large, I think that a working definition of a patient is a structure that cannot understand its medical care without the intermediary of a clinician, which I've tried to indicate here on the graph on the right. So I'm saying a person has epistemic rights. And so if a patient is to be a person, the patient also have to have these same epistemic rights. Well, what are epistemic rights? Well, they're the rights to data, information, knowledge, and understanding, particularly related to ourselves, and the right to the sharing of our data, information, knowledge, understanding, again, particularly related to ourselves. And if these rights are impinged upon, we refer to these as epistemic injustices. And there are two commonly discussed epistemic injustices, and both of which I'll address in this talk. The first is hermeneutical injustices, and that's the impeding of self-understanding. And the second is testimonial injustices, which is the impeding of self-advocacy. So for a patient to be a person, patients must be able to acquire knowledge, express values, and exercise agency within the context of their care. And to deliver healthcare to persons, as opposed to simply patients, healthcare systems must create epistemic ecosystems free of epistemic injustices. And that is the ecosystems that the patients operate in must help patients to understand their care and their circumstances, and help patients advocate for their care and the definition of their circumstances. So, and I would claim that current patient ecosystems fall short of these requirements. In general, I think if I look at my own ecosystems that I work within as a patient, they're monolithic, they're simplistic, they're unidirectional. They're monolithic, they're the same for everyone. They're simplistic, they only give you a few simple ways of interacting with your data, and they're unidirectional. They talk to me, it doesn't really allow me to talk to them. And so in these ways, they do not support patients as persons. And so we might ask, well, why has healthcare created patient ecosystems like this? And I will suggest that there are two ways we might think about why this is the case. The first I'm going to call health incentives, and the second epistemic habits. So let me go into these. So health incentives is what is the health that the healthcare system is trying to produce, and what are the incentives in place to achieve that? And to understand this, I'm going to turn again to Uwe Reinhardt, who points out that there are two parallel health systems with parallel objectives. The objective of, we might say, health system A is enhancing the patient's quality of life. We want them to be healthy. We're treating their disease. We're treating their injuries. Well, simultaneously, there is another health system that is enhancing the provider's quality of life, and that's through salaries, et cetera. And so both things are going on, and sometimes the objectives for achieving the health of the providers is at odds with achieving the health of the patients in objective A. So for examples of this. Well, in Australia, where I'm living right now, I think there's a nice example of the financial health being maximized for the providers in a court case in 1996. This is Breen v. Williams. And the setup for this is, it was traced clear back to the 1970s, where a woman wanted copies of her medical records in order to join a class action lawsuit in the United States against the breast implant manufacturer. And so her claim was first filed in 1977. She was not unhappy with the surgeon, simply wanted to join this class action lawsuit against the manufacturer. And the surgeon refused to give her the records to join the lawsuit. When it finally, nearly 20 years later, made it to the High Court of Australia, the court held that the collection and retention of the data was an economic advantage to the defendant, that is the surgeon, in relation to being further consulted by the plaintiff. So if the surgeon had the monopoly on the information, that would maximize his economic well-being because the patient would have to pay consulting fees in order to see the data. The government thought this was a bad decision, and Australians have since been giving access to their medical records through legislative processes. So that's an example of the financial health of Objective B of the providers versus the health of the patients. I think another kind of health that is created is status health, where the system is set up in such a way that there is a status differential between the providers and the patients that the system is sometimes designed to maximize. And you see this with these, kind of glib statements like, please do not confuse your Google search with my medical degree. So status health is a kind of competing health in the health systems. And if we view these things as flawed, like the holding information from patients for the sake of economic gain of the providers, we have to remember that healthcare systems cater to various interest groups, and these flaws only can exist to the degree that patients remain uninformed about how the system works. So what do I mean by epistemic habits? Well, these are the things that we're trained to do. So we don't really think about it. It's just, oh, this is what we've always done. This is what we did in medical school, or this is what we did in nursing school. And so why should I do something different? And where do these epistemic habits come from? Well, I recently read, I thought, a quite wonderful book by J. Katz called The Silent World of Doctor and Patient. And this was written in 1984. And Katz was a psychiatrist by training, but a law professor at Yale University by profession. And so this book is both an interesting examination of medicine circa 1984 from a physician's point of view and a legal point of view. And so I kind of view Katz with healthcare on the couch, and this is his his psychoanalysis of the healthcare system. And in his diagnosis, he makes, well, I guess before I go on to that, I would say that this was the era that I had my childhood cancer. So I had my first cancer in 1976, and I had my last kind of subsequent surgery related to my cancers in 1985. So the decade, preceding the publication of the book. And talking to my mother about how healthcare was practiced, it really was a very silent world. She would say they didn't tell you much, and they asked you even less than what they told you. So what were these kind of his diagnosis of medicine that I think are relevant to our discussion today? So first off, he says that modern medicine diverged from the openness of science and adopted uncritically ancient medicine's dictum of not disclosing. And ancient medicine said, don't disclose, because there was really no basis for the medical treatment. And the only tool that the physician had in their hand was the faith that the patient had in the healing power of the physician. And so there wasn't a scientific basis for what they were doing, and so you had to hide that fact. And so that's where this habit of not disclosing came from. Whereas science, which became the basis for medicine in the early 1900s, would have said, disclose. Science is open. Science is about telling everything that's going on. Similarly, Katz found that clinicians' own uncomfortableness with uncertainty compels them to hide uncertainty from patients. And again, science would be for advocating the disclosure of uncertainty. But this uncomfortableness leads clinicians to hide their uncertainty from patients. And this comes up with a habit of what we might call habits of deception. And finally, medicine just undervalued patients as being persons with distinct values and capabilities. That they don't understand that what is valuable to a patient may not be valuable to the doctor and vice versa. And the patients really are people that are capable of making decisions about their care. And this undervaluing of patients is the basis of what I'm calling the habits of paternalism. So that was 1984, and there's been a lot changed in the world since then. So medicine isn't identical. There have been internal changes in medicine, recognizing that there's problems with medical errors, there's problems with quality and outcomes, and that perhaps patients might play a role in improving these problems. Similarly, so there's just been a broad expansion of the concept of citizens' epistemic rights. And separate from medicine, that we just feel like if data is being used to make decisions about us, we should have rights to know about that data, that whether it's in loans from banks or policing decisions. And medicine has not been exempt from this general expansion of citizens' rights to access to data about them. And there has similarly been an expanding recognition of patients as persons, as indicated in that early 1964 panel. So we do know that values of patients are oftentimes distinct from clinicians, and that what's good for the doctor is not necessarily good for the patient, and hence there's things like joint decision making. And there's probably even a kind of a change in society where there's an obligation of patients to be responsible participants in their healthcare. And so these lead to a different kind of epistemic circumstances for patients than what Katz was writing about in 1984. So let's look a little bit about what this would be like. And so I'm going to use, with permission, my friend Angela. Angela was well educated. She has a bachelor's and a master's degree. She actually worked in an academic health system. She was an engaged patient. She used her patient portal. She monitored some chronic conditions, kept Excel spreadsheets of her measurements related to things. And in 2017, 2018, she's pregnant with her first pregnancy, and she has twins. So it's a high-risk pregnancy. And what we see with Angela, she's really quite an epistemically complex patient. She has a perinatologist because of the risk of the pregnancy. She's texting him blood pressure measurements before she goes to bed each night. She's reviewing scientific literature to try to understand her, what they're telling her in the clinic. And she's actually, this is kind of a nice example of, if it's not an injustice, it must be a justice, testimonial justice, that she's a really quite capable advocate for herself. And she's instructing the nurses on how to measure her blood pressure, because what the doctor has found in researching the literature, the nurses aren't measuring her blood pressure in the way that he wants it to be measured. And so she's actually instructing them in how to do it, and they're following her instructions. So she's a very involved patient, but yet at the same time, she's still a non-understanding patient. So when she figures out, when they start saying that she has preeclampsia, she says, well, I know about that a little bit because I saw an episode of Downton Abbey where that was in. So her medical knowledge for her pregnancy condition is coming from a TV show. And in reality, she just doesn't grasp or understand the seriousness of her condition. And so the whole kind of situation around her is contributing to this hermeneutical injustice of her not understanding. And because she doesn't understand how serious her condition is, she's ignoring her symptoms, et cetera, until things get to a very kind of advanced stage. So that's, I think she's not an atypical patient. And some of them I'm going to, throw out of like, what do we need to do for a patient like Angela in the 21st century? What gifts do we need, Promethean gifts do we need so that the healthcare that she receives can be the healthcare of a person, and avoiding these epistemic injustices that I had mentioned previously. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. So she has preeclampsia. They have to induce labor in order to save her life. And so her twins are born very prematurely, and they're in the newborn ICU for 6 weeks. And while she is in this, while her babies are in the ICU, it's kind of an information desert. She never gets to see the doctors. She's only getting information kind of, she says, like through the grapevine from nurses. And she doesn't really understand what her role is supposed to be. The doctors are kind of just like, trust me, don't worry. Whereas the nurses are telling her you need to proactively advocate for your children, but she's supposed to proactively advocate for them. How? Because she doesn't get any information. The information isn't being released through the portal until the babies are discharged. And so then when the babies are discharged, she gets 30 pages of discharge notes. And to me, this is an example of hermeneutical injustice, because the data were not provided to her at the time when she needed it for understanding. And so I think that an epistemic gift to the 21st century patient to be a person is timely epistemic resources. Well, the babies are discharged, and she's told by the healthcare team to carefully monitor all of the baby's inputs and outputs. And not surprisingly, there's an app for that. So she gets the app on her phone and dutifully enters all the data into the app. And then when she goes to the clinic appointments, the data is just ignored because the clinicians don't have time to ingest the data, and there's not a mechanism to automatically ingest the data. And so this is a testimonial injustice. Angela is not being allowed to effectively advocate for the care of her infants because we're ignoring the very data that we asked her to collect. Well, I'm going to take a little sidestep here, and I'm going to introduce you to Freeman Dyson. You may recognize Freeman Dyson as being one of the most prominent scientists of the latter half of the 20th century. He just died a few years ago, great mathematical physicist. And when he was a relatively young man in the 1950s, he was vacationing in San Diego, and he got bit by a dog. And so he went to see a general practitioner, and the question is, should I get the rabies shot or not? And in the 1950s, the rabies shot itself carried a significant risk of death. And the doctor was able to talk through the probabilities and what the risks of the various outcomes were with Freeman Dyson. And I think I kind of picture any good doctor treating a physicist should have a whiteboard, a chalkboard where they could write all this down. And the doctor really worked through with Freeman the mathematics of the decision. And this is introduced in the very first page of the classic clinical decision analysis book by Weinstein and Feinberg. So Freeman Dyson, almost like the ideal patient to be rationally discuss with the doctors their care. Well, I think for the 21st century, what we need patient-facing decision support. And when we say things like patient-facing decision support, you can't replace the doctor. I don't want the decision support to have Angela become like the doctor. I want the decision support to help Angela be like Freeman Dyson, where she could reason through what are the risks of the various decisions she's facing, like what are the risks of immediate delivery to her fetus's development versus the risks of delayed delivery to her own death, or how can she weigh the values of her strong desire to have a vaginal delivery versus the clinician's value of rapid C-sections. So really what I want to see are decision supports to help Angela be as informed of a patient as she can be for interacting with her doctors. If I look at my own self, so this is a graph I've made of all the healthcare workers that I've interacted with in a kind of a face-to-face manner. So kind of ignoring the pathologists and the radiologists that are talking to my doctors, but I'm not talking to directly. And each one of these kind of boxes is a different move I've made in my life. So this is my childhood. This is one of my graduate school experiences, another graduate experience. First job in Pittsburgh, where I first met Chuck Friedman, San Diego, Salt Lake City, here I am in Australia. And so if I look at this, I move around a lot, especially if I'm comparing myself to my parents who have lived in two houses in the 60 years of their marriage. So if I look at this graph, what does this imply about my epistemic needs as a patient in the 21st century? And if I'm going to get care as a person, what might my needs be? Well, that graph is to me the importance of the gift of fair data, the findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable data. In Australia, I had the opportunity to get early access to the COVID-19 vaccines because I'm a childhood cancer survivor. But when I went to the doctor to get the shots, who I had not seen before just because of the craziness of how it happened in Australia, she asked me to prove that I was a cancer survivor. Well, how many people can really prove that if they don't have data? As it turns out, for a long story, I actually had my pathology reports from 1976 and 1983, and I could whip those up on my computer and prove to her that I was a cancer survivor. At the same time, I have years of monitoring of my remaining kidney because I had one removed as a child. And so what I would like is these years of my kidney function measurements to speak Australian. When I come here, I can give my doctor these measurements. And so this dream of interoperability, it doesn't exist. But I think that is something that my mobility as a chronic patient speaks to. Now, I realize that these would not be gifts from a God, but they're engineered solutions. And as engineered solutions, they cost time, they cost money, they cost social capital. And I think it's important to think, when I'm talking about these epistemic rights, these hermeneutical injustices and testimonial injustices, they're not a healthcare process. We need to think of them first as human rights, not as issues of healthcare. I'm not so much interested in that, if you give me my data, I can show that outcomes improve. That's the healthcare question. I'm saying I have a right to the data, and the healthcare questions we should be asking is how best might we share that data so that outcomes are improved. And one of the important things, if I'm talking about human rights, is we have to realize that no right is meaningful unless there's a corresponding duty assigned to that. And Lanny Watson, in her book, The Right to Know, points out that all epistemic claim rights correlate with epistemic duties. So if I have a right to something, but no one has a duty to provide that for me, it's not a meaningful right. So an example from Australia. Australia has a patient health record that they're very proud of called My Health Record, but unfortunately, it's mostly empty and rarely used. And it's empty because while it addressed patients' right to health data, it didn't assign a corresponding duty to providers to share the data. And since there wasn't a duty to share, the providers didn't share because they viewed it as their economic interest to not share, or it was bothersome to share. So we have to have a duty assigned to a right in order for things to be effective. If I look at the United States, there's been a 30-odd year expansion since HIPAA in 1996 to give patients access to their data. And most recently, with the 21st Century Cures Act, the banning of information blocking. So in the United States, there's great access to data. But I ask, are we simply replicating Warner's 1960s ICU nurse, where we are overwhelming patients with data, but not providing them the knowledge they need to understand that data? Well, I think to some extent that's true, but not completely. Because if we look at what's going on in the United States, parallel, starting the same year as HIPAA, there's PubMed. There's putting Medline online, freely accessible to the public and to the world. And joining that in 1998, Medline Plus, where we're creating patient-looking medical knowledge available free to everyone in the world. So this is really trying to couple knowledge sharing with the data sharing. But we need to go further. We need to have that data sharing be computable knowledge that's linked to patient data so that we can facilitate self-understanding and facilitate self-decision making. Now, I anticipate in this claim of sharing computable knowledge linked to patient data that there's going to be resistance. I realize this is going to be technically difficult, but I really think that the biggest problem we're going to face is it disrupts objective B of our dual health system. So just like 30 years ago, hoarding information was viewed as being economically valuable to the clinicians, there's going to be a lot of people that view as hoarding knowledge is going to be economically valuable to the providers. And so I expect pushback from that. And I expect progress to be slow, but marching on. And so the gifts of FHIR that have been given to patients and the many other gifts are contributing to a slow but steady progress towards patients being persons. It's slow, but as Peter Gabriel's saying, you can blow out a candle, but you can't blow out a fire. Once the flames begin to catch, the winds will blow it higher. And so I think we do have a bright future for patients as persons ahead of us. And so with that, I would like to thank you for the time you've given me, and I would be happy to answer any questions you have to ask me.